Imagine, one summer night in 1849 in the silent corridors of a Baltimore hospital, the nurse on duty finds a little girl abandoned at the gate. She says not a word. Her eyes are empty, but she reflects the gestures, sounds, even the facial expressions of anyone standing nearby. No one knows her name, no one knows where she came from, and no trace of her family can be found. Over the years, doctors, priests, and even curious scholars have tried to solve the mystery. But the more they observe, the more they wonder, is she just an unfortunate child or a strange mirror reflecting something deep in the human soul? For decades, medical records and personal diaries have been haunted by her presence, a silent but haunting witness. And perhaps, while listening to this story, you will also wonder if those eyes were looking at us, what would they repeat back from us? In the winter of 1904, the Henderson family posed for what seemed like a simple photograph. Decades later, that very image would return to them, carrying something far more unsettling than memory. 74 years after the shutter clicked in November of 1978, Sarah Henderson stepped into her late grandmother's study inside the family's Lincoln Park mansion. The house itself was a relic of Chicago's Gilded Age, its Victorian rooms heavy with silence, each drawer and cabinet guarding generations of secrets. Her grandmother, Elena Henderson, had been the careful keeper of these memories. Letters, ledgers, photographs all stacked neatly in mahogany drawers that smelled faintly of dust and time. While sorting through old papers, Sarah's hands brushed against a leather-bound album hidden beneath faded financial records. Its brass clasp had tarnished its cover, worn from decades of use. Inside were sepia-toned portraits of Chicago's high society in the early 1900s. Weddings, gatherings, celebrations long since forgotten. But one image caught her breath. A Christmas portrait from 1904, 5 figures arranged stiffly in the mansion's grand parlor. Cornelius Henderson, her great-great-grandfather, stood tall beside his wife Margaret and their 3 children. Behind them loomed an ornate fireplace crowned by a gilded mirror. On the surface, it was nothing more than a wealthy family's holiday memento. Yet, Sarah brought the photograph to Northwestern University where she worked. Using newly acquired high-resolution scanning equipment, she and Professor Michael Chen enlarged the image, pulling out details unseen by the naked eye. The texture of clothing, the faint expressions on faces, even the delicate carvings in the parlor's woodwork. Everything matched the elegance of the era until Sarah focused on the mirror. There, reflected in the gilded glass, was a 6th figure. A man who had not stood with the family, a man no one had ever mentioned. His face was blurred by shadow, but his posture was unmistakable. He was watching, and in his hands, he carried something long and thin, nearly 3 feet in length, something that had no place in a Christmas portrait. The enhanced copies confirmed it. This figure had been captured in the original photograph, hidden in plain sight, for more than 70 years. But who was he? And what exactly was the object he held? The next morning, Sarah carried the images to the Chicago Historical Society. Their archivist, Margaret Kowalski, examined them carefully. She knew the Henderson family well from the city's archives. Cornelius Henderson, the steel and railroad magnate, who had built an empire in the years after the Great Fire of 1871. But as she studied the ghostly figure in the mirror, even her seasoned eyes grew uncertain. Who had been standing just outside the frame on that winter's night in 1904, And why did the Henderson family never speak of him? The Hendersons were not merely another wealthy Chicago family. They owned several properties across the city, but their Lincoln Park mansion, the same one captured in that unsettling 1904 photograph, was their crown jewel. Archivist Margaret Kowalski sifted through the past with practiced care. In the society pages of the Chicago Tribune, December 1904, she found glowing coverage of the Hendersons' Christmas celebration. The paper called it one of the most elegant gatherings of the season. Dozens of guests were in attendance. The decorations were described as lavish, and a professional photographer had been hired to immortalize the evening. On the surface, everything seemed perfect, untouched by shadow. But if the night had held any strange disruptions, the newspapers remained silent. To understand that moment, one must remember what Chicago was in 1904. The city stood at the very height of its Gilded Age splendor, its skyline rising on steel fortunes, and the lingering prestige of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Industrialists and magnates built great homes filling neighborhoods with glittering wealth. The Hendersons dined among railroad tycoons, meat-packing kings, and political power brokers. Cornelius Henderson himself sat on corporate boards with friendships that reached into the heart of City Hall, and yet, beneath the polished tension simmered. Strikes rattled the streets. Labor unrest threatened the peace of drawing rooms and parlors. Wealth created both power and enemies. Some prominent families even received threatening letters that year, forcing them to hire private guards for their soirees. Then Margaret uncovered something that made Sarah pause. Police records from early 1905 revealed that Cornelius Henderson himself had been questioned by detectives not as a suspect, not officially, but in connection with the disappearance of a man named Thomas Garrett. Garrett, Cornelius's business partner in a modest construction company, had last been seen on January 15th, scarcely 3 weeks after that Christmas portrait was taken. The records painted a haunting picture. Garrett was only in his 30s, a husband and a father of 2 young children. His life had shown no signs of unraveling, no deaths, no despair. And yet, he had vanished. Detective reports described how Garrett had confided in his wife Elizabeth about troubling irregularities in the company's accounts. Numbers that didn't add up. Costs that seemed to bleed into shadows. He had not yet revealed the details, but his worry had been clear. Then suddenly, he was gone. Cornelius told the police that Garrett had been restless, speaking of leaving Chicago altogether, of seeking opportunity in California. But Elizabeth insisted her husband had never spoken such words. Quite the opposite, Garrett had just signed a lease on a larger apartment and secured a place for their eldest child in an exclusive school. His roots were sinking deeper into Chicago, not pulling away. Despite interviews and reports, the case stalled. No body was ever recovered. No evidence surfaced. Officially, the disappearance remained unsolved. Within 6 months, Elizabeth Garrett had taken her children and returned to Pennsylvania, her future shattered. And what of Cornelius Henderson? With his partner gone, he assumed full control of the construction company. City records revealed that almost immediately the business began to flourish. Lucrative public works contracts rolled in during 1905 and 1906, feeding the family's wealth. As Sarah sat before the digitized image of her ancestors once again, she could not ignore the timing. The mysterious figure in the mirror, the vanished partner, the sudden rise in fortune. Could the Christmas portrait of 1904 have captured more than just a family gathering? Could it have captured the shadow of what was about to unfold? The figure in the mirror was no longer just a curiosity. He had been there in the Henderson parlor on Christmas Day, 1904, only 3 weeks before Thomas Garrett vanished. Sarah sought answers in science. She carried the photograph to the University of Chicago, where forensic expert Dr. Robert Sterling agreed to examine it. Sterling was no stranger to mysteries buried in old images. He had worked with law enforcement and academics alike, trained to notice what the eye overlooked. His attention turned to the object in the figure's hands. Using digital enhancement, he measured it carefully, 36 inches in length. One end, he noted, formed what looked like a handle. At first, it could have been a walking stick, perhaps an umbrella. Yet, the image revealed something else. Metallic glints caught the parlor's lamplight, reflections inconsistent with the wood or fabric. Sterling leaned closer to the screen. The evidence suggested not an accessory, but a weapon, a rifle, or perhaps a shotgun. Then he studied the man himself. The clothing was formal, but not of the Hendersons' caliber. Respectable enough to enter their home, but simpler, less adorned. His stance was striking, not relaxed, not accidental. He was positioned with purpose behind and to the left of the photographer, close enough to observe, hidden enough to go unnoticed. Unless, of course, one knew to look at the mirror. This presence, Sterling remarked, was not chance. It was deliberate. The thought weighed heavily on Sarah. The photograph seemed to whisper that this man had come to the Henderson gathering with intent, with warning, or with threat. Back at the Historical Society, Sarah and Margaret dug deeper into the Henderson businesses. The trail of Thomas Garrett grew sharper. Among construction company records, they found notes Garrett's own that revealed the shadows behind the brick and mortar. Inflated costs, phantom workers, and worse, a web of bribes, kickbacks funneled to city officials in exchange for public contracts. It was a conspiracy, plain and deliberate. Garrett had been on the brink of exposing it. He had already arranged to meet James McKenna, an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune. The date had been set January 20th, 1905. Only 5 days after Garrett disappeared. McKenna's surviving notes buried in the Tribune archives confirm that Garrett had promised documents, proof of corruption stretching across companies and City Hall itself. The Tribune had even prepared a series of exposés for February. But without Garrett, the evidence vanished. The series was cancelled. The silence was absolute. Sarah sat with this knowledge and returned once more to the mirror. If Garrett had threatened to unravel their scheme, then who had been sent to stop him? Chicago's underworld in 1904 was no stranger to such men. Wealthy businessmen, politicians, industrialists. They often employed private guards, and when those failed, they reached for darker solutions. Names echoed in police records. Among them, Vincent Vinnie Torino. Torino's reputation preceded him. 6 feet tall, immaculately dressed, always carrying hidden firearms. He had been an enforcer for hire, blending seamlessly into parlors and boardrooms while silencing problems others could not. Police suspected his hand in disappearances, unexplained deaths, quiet vanishments across the business world. But witnesses never spoke. Charges never stuck. Torino was a shadow that lingered in respectable rooms. The figure in the Henderson mirror, bore his likeness, and records showed something even more damning. Torino had ties to the very circle Garrett was investigating. A network of businessmen and officials siphoning money from the city, for years all protected by silence. If Torino was present in the Henderson mansion that Christmas night, then what did it mean? Did Cornelius Henderson invite him there, knowing his purpose? Or did he enter as a warning, an omen of what was to come? The object in the man's hands was no mere accessory. It was a weapon, and it spoke of intent. The timing was undeniable. Thomas Garrett vanished 3 weeks after the Henderson family's Christmas gathering, just days before he was set to meet the Tribune reporter. Sarah began to see the photograph not as a family memory, but as a record of a crime in progress, a secret preserved in silver and glass. The presence of Vincent Torino, reflected in that gilded mirror, placed him within the mansion on the very night when the conspiracy must have been sealed. And when Sarah traced the guest list of that evening, the shadows only deepened. Among them, City Building Inspector Harold Marsh, later dismissed for bribery in 1906. Alderman Patrick Connolly, dragged before a grand jury in 1907 for fraudulent contracts. Names that together formed a pattern. Henderson's construction company was only a single piece in a much larger machine. It was not merely one business partner's disappearance. It was a network, a scheme to drain the city's coffers, the profits divided neatly between businessmen, aldermen, and inspectors. Thomas Garrett's evidence would have blown it open. His silence, ensured by violence, kept it alive. Even the police inquiry bore the fingerprints of corruption. Detectives who pressed too close were reassigned or quietly punished. Sergeant William Murphy, who had begun to look into Henderson's circle, was abruptly demoted to patrol duty in March 1905. The message was clear: some questions were not meant to be asked, and so the scheme flourished. For years, it siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from Chicago taxpayers. The city's growth lined the pockets of men who smiled at Christmas tables, who shook hands at charity galas, who spoke of civic pride while plotting theft and murder. That single photograph had not only captured a family portrait, it had frozen unknowingly the planning of a killing. The ghostly outline in the mirror was not a mistake of light, not an accident. It was evidence, a fragment of a conspiracy buried for more than 70 years. For Sarah, the discovery reshaped her family's story. The Henderson fortune, which had blossomed after 1905, was suddenly cast in a darker light. Museums, libraries, cultural institutions bore their name, but beneath the marble was blood. The wealth that lifted her ancestors came at the expense of Garrett's family, who had returned to Pennsylvania in grief and poverty. His children grew up without the opportunities their father's honesty might have secured, while the Hendersons thrived on his silence. Now the question hung in the air: what should be done with this truth? The conspirators were long dead. The police of today could not prosecute the shadows of yesterday. And yet, Thomas Garrett's descendants might still live unaware of the betrayal that had altered their family's cause. Sarah chose to bring her findings to the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit. She delivered the enhanced photograph, the records, the history that had slumbered too long. It would not undo the crime, but perhaps it could bring closure. The 1904 portrait, once an innocent memento, had revealed itself as something far more haunting. A reminder that the past does not stay buried. that even in the most polished halls, secrets wait sometimes for decades until someone looks closely enough. A mirror, a reflection, a figure holding a weapon. Preserved for 74 years, waiting for Sarah's hands to turn the page to see what no one else had seen. And perhaps you wonder too, how many other family albums rest quietly in attics and drawers holding their own unspoken truths?